In the early morning darkness of April 1861, as the first rays of sunlight touched the coastline of Charleston, South Carolina, America stood on the edge of a breaking point it could no longer avoid. A moment when tensions that had been building for decades suddenly snapped, and the nation found itself divided beyond repair, setting into motion the beginning of the American Civil War, a conflict that would become the bloodiest and most defining struggle in the country's history. And on that day, everything changed. The North and the South no longer saw each other as fellow Americans, but as two different worlds separated by beliefs, power, and the future of human freedom. And as the cannons prepared to fire on Fort Sumter, the final sparks that lit the fuse had already been ignited long before. Through years of arguments about slavery, states' rights, political power, and the deep cultural divide that shaped everyday life across the young nation, with Southern leaders insisting on preserving slavery as the foundation of their economic strength, while the North steadily moved toward a world where slavery would one day end. And in the months leading up to the conflict, America became a storm of speeches, anger, and unhealed wounds. Families arguing across dinner tables, newspapers filled with fiery headlines, politicians warning that the Union was about to fall apart, and as Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860 without a single Southern vote, Southern states felt ignored, unheard, and betrayed. They believed the federal government no longer represented them, and one by one, they began to secede, declaring themselves no longer part of the United States, forming what they called the Confederate States of America. And suddenly, the stars on the U.S. flag represented a broken family, a family that no one knew how to bring back together. By early 1861, 7 Southern states had already left, and more were preparing to join, while Lincoln, still unable to take office until March, watched helplessly as the nation he hoped to protect fell apart in front of him. And when he finally took the oath of office, he faced the unimaginable responsibility of trying to save the Union without throwing the nation into war. Yet war arrived anyway, carried on the wind of anger, mistrust, and fear. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Union fort sitting in Charleston Harbor, and the explosions echoed across the water, shaking the ground, lighting the darkness, and signaling to the entire nation that there was no turning back. The Civil War had begun for 34 hours. The fort was bombarded as smoke filled the sky, and people gathered along the shore to watch, unable to look away from the destruction that marked the start of a conflict that would claim more American lives than all previous wars combined. And while no one died during the bombardment, the war it unleashed would leave the nation covered in scars. As Lincoln received the news, he felt the weight of history settle onto his shoulders, understanding that the Union must now defend itself. And so he called for 75,000 volunteers to join the Army, a move that shocked the South even more, causing 4 additional states to secede, bringing the Confederacy to 11 states. Suddenly, families were torn apart. Brother fighting brother, father against son, friendships destroyed by loyalty to different sides, and the country that had once celebrated unity now faced the terrifying reality of a war that no one could escape, whether they stood on a battlefield or simply tried to survive in their hometown. In those early days of the war, both sides believed the conflict would end quickly, with confident speeches and daring promises. But they had no idea that the war would become a long, brutal struggle, filled with tragedies that would reshape America forever. Young men rushed to enlist, imagining glory and adventure, unaware of the suffering ahead. Disease, hunger, endless marches and battles that would push them to the limits of human endurance. Mothers stood on porches, wiping tears as their sons marched away, unsure if they would ever see them again. And children watched soldiers ride past, not realizing that history was unfolding before their eyes. The Civil War did not only start in Charleston, it began in every home, every state, every heart that felt fear, pride, anger, or hope for the future of the nation. As the war expanded, the North's factories began producing weapons, uniforms, and supplies at incredible speed, while the South relied on its farms and limited industry, determined to fight for what it believed was its right to govern itself. And as both sides prepared for battle, leaders such as Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, Ulysses S. Grant, and Robert E. Lee emerged as key figures who would shape the direction of the war and decide the fate of millions. But in 1861, no one knew how long the war would last or how deeply it would change them. All they knew was that the old America had died at Fort Sumter, replaced by a new world where the future would be determined by bravery, sacrifice, and the willingness to fight for what each side believed was right. In the months that followed, the early battles of the Civil War would surprise both armies. The First Battle of Bull Run revealed that the South was far stronger than the North expected, and the North realized that victory would require more than confidence. It would require unity, strategy, and a determination that could survive endless losses. And as the first year of the war unfolded, Americans on both sides came to understand a hard truth. This would not be a short conflict, but a long, painful struggle that would define the nation's identity, determine the fate of slavery, and test whether the United States could remain united at all. This was the beginning of the Civil War, the day America broke into two, the moment history changed direction, and the story of a nation fighting not only against each other, but for its own soul.